She sought a blacksmith to forge a mask to hide the scars that destroyed her life, but instead he forged the broken woman herself into the warrior who would wear those same scars as her greatest weapon. The resilience that turns scars into armor is one of the most powerful journeys there is. Show your support for her in the comments and subscribe to witness what this new warrior will do next. The darkness in the devil's throat was a living entity, a shroud of cold stone and oppressive silence that swallowed all sound. Crouched atop a rocky outcrop, Nita was a part of that darkness, as still as the Sierra Madre mountains themselves. The cold night wind traced the contours of her face, kissing the silver marks the moonlight revealed on her skin. They were no longer wounds. They were dry rivers, maps of an ancient pain that now served as her guide. Below her, in the narrow bed of the canyon, the torches of the Mexican soldiers flickered like lost fireflies, ignorant that the trap had already closed. The scent of pine, dust, and the metallic fear of the men drifted up to her. Nita inhaled deeply, not to calm herself, but to savor the moment, feeling the power that emanated from this place of her greatest suffering. Her fingers traced the deepest scar, the one that ran from her temple to the corner of her mouth, a physical and constant memory of the massacre. Once, that touch would have brought a wave of paralyzing shame. Now, it brought clarity. She felt no hatred, no vengeance, only a cold and precise resolution like obsidian. Her lips moved, emitting a low, guttural sound, the perfect imitation of a night owl's call, a sound lost in the wind to the soldiers' ears, but one that echoed like thunder to her people, hidden in the crevices of the rocks. Below, the first cry of surprise was followed by the dull thud of a falling body, and then by calculated chaos. The hunted had become the trap, and the memory of her pain was the bait that would ensure the survival of the Chiheni. Like a shadow detaching from the rock, Nita descended the cliff face with an agility that belied the brutality of what was to come. The air filled with the low whistle of arrows and the fleeting glint of blades under the moon. The Chiheni did not scream. They moved like vengeful spirits, using every shadow, every ledge. The soldiers' panic was a disordered cacophony of shots fired blindly, their screams echoing against the canyon walls, amplifying the terror. Nita landed on the hideous valley floor with the soft sound of moccasins on dust. Her knife, an extension of her will, moved with lethal economy. There was no passion in her strikes, only the purpose of extinguishing the flickering lights of the torches, one by one. The silence that followed was heavier than before, now stained with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less time than it takes a cloud to cover the moon. Nita stood motionless in the center of the carnage, her chest rising and falling in a controlled rhythm. Coyotl, an older warrior whose eyes held the wisdom of 1,000 nights like this one, approached her, his face a mask of somber respect. He said nothing, only inclining his head toward the scattered bodies, an acknowledgement of the deadly precision of her plan. Nita felt no triumph, only the cold relief of a duty fulfilled. Each fallen enemy was another day of life for her people, a price paid with the steel and darkness she had learned to call home. Under her watchful eye, the Chiheni warriors moved with silent efficiency, stripping the dead of rifles, ammunition, and canteens of water. Nothing was wasted. Every bullet was a promise of a hunt, every knife a tool for life, every piece of cloth a patch against the coming cold. Nita did not take part in the gathering. Her role had ended with the last life taken. She was the mind behind the storm, the calm in the eye of the hurricane. Her attention turned to the moon, which bathed the canyon in a ghostly light. The place that had disfigured her was now the tomb of her enemies, consecrated not by hatred, but by necessity. When the last bag of provisions was tied, Nita raised her hand, a subtle gesture that cut through the air. It was time to disappear. As quickly as they had appeared, the Chiheni dissolved back into the shadows of the Sierra Madre, leaving behind nothing more than the bodies and the dying echo of their fears. Nita was the last to leave. She cast one final look over the devil's throat, not with sadness or satisfaction, but with the recognition of a circle closing. The scars on her face throbbed with the cold, a constant reminder that survival was not a destination, but a journey, and the night was still long. The march back to the hidden camp was a procession of ghosts. Each warrior followed the invisible trail left by Nita, their steps muffled by the earth and the experience of a lifetime spent moving unseen. The weight of the stolen rifles and ammunition was the weight of hope. The cold now seemed to seep into Nita's bones, a profound exhaustion that the battle did not allow her to feel, but that the night's aftermath exacted its price. She did not look back, but she felt the presence of every one of her people, a silent current of trust following her through the darkness. Finally, a familiar scent of juniper smoke and the muffled sound of a child coughing reached her, the beacon that guided her home. The rancheria was a precarious pocket of life nestled in the heart of the mountain, invisible to anyone who did not know its exact location. Wickiups of branches and hides blended into the landscape, and a single low fire cast dancing shadows on the anxious faces that waited. No one greeted her with words. The respect of the Chiheni was a quiet thing, seen in the gazes of the elders and the way the women made a path for her. A small girl with large, curious eyes stopped chewing her piece of dried meat to stare at her. Her eyes did not focus on Nita's, but on the silver web that marked her cheek. For an instant, the weight of the child's gaze was sharper than any blade, and Nita felt the familiar urge to turn her face away. This vulnerability before an innocent gaze reveals the true depth of her scars. Leave a comment with a word of strength for Nita and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of her fight. She suppressed the instinct, forcing herself to hold the child's gaze for a moment that felt like an eternity, until the girl's mother, sensing the tension, gently pulled her close, whispering something in her ear. The spell was broken. Kyle approached, his face impassive, diverting attention from the fragile moment. The weapons are stored. The ammunition is enough for 2 moons. We have divided the food, he reported in a low voice. His practicality was an anchor, pulling Nita back from the edge of her memories to the reality of leadership. She nodded, her chin raised, the mask of the cold. Strategist back in place. Double the watch until dawn. No one rests completely tonight. With a nod to Kale, Nita retreated to her wickiup, a modest and isolated shelter on the edge of the camp. Inside, away from the eyes that crowned her as a savior, the obsidian armor began to crack. The low fire in the center cast trembling shadows that danced like ghosts on her skin. A clay basin of still water served as her mirror, and in it the firelight accentuated every valley and ridge of her marked face. The warrior who ambushed soldiers in the darkness disappeared, giving way to the girl who remembered the fire, the screams, and the cold steel tearing at her skin. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust and dried blood on her cheek, falling into the water and shattering her reflection into 1,000 pieces. The sound of the leather flap of her wickiup being pushed aside was like a stone thrown into still water, breaking the fragile quiet of her pain. She stiffened instantly, the back of her hand wiping the moisture from her cheek with a silent fury. The warrior was back, raising invisible walls. A man entered, ducking to pass through the low opening. He was not Chiheni. Elias was a scout, an outsider whose loyalty was bought but whose skill was unquestionable. His eyes, lighter than those of the mountain people, did not scan the hut but landed directly on her, noticing the shimmering path the tear had left in the dust on her skin. Nita turned her face. Instinctively, offering him her less marked profile, anger simmering beneath the surface at his intrusion and at her own weakness. "What do you want?" Her voice was sharp gravel. "I bring news from the forts," he said, his tone low and rough, devoid of any surprise or pity she might have expected, but his eyes did not waver. They traced the line of the main scar from temple to mouth, not with a child's curiosity or the veiled horror of others, but with a quiet, almost reverent intensity. He didn't see the disfigurement. He seemed to be reading the map of a battle she had won, and for the first time in years, Nita did not know how to respond to a man's gaze. The silence stretched, thin and brittle as ice on a creek. Nita felt the heat rise up her neck, a helpless fury at being seen this way. She forced her jaw to relax, her body to straighten, rebuilding herself piece by piece before him. "Speak, then." Her voice came out harsher than she intended. "What news could not wait for?" "Dawn?" Elias finally looked away, not out of discomfort, but as if granting her space to breathe. He moved to the side so the low fire was between them. "The bluecoats are moving, 2 columns leaving from Fort Bowie. Your attack in the throat. You stirred up the anthill, and they know who led it." The information was like a bucket of cold water, extinguishing the fire of her personal shame and igniting the cold flame of strategy. The world contracted, focusing only on the threat. "How many? Where are they headed?" she asked, her voice now firm, that of the leader her people needed. Elias didn't hesitate. "About 50 in each. One is heading west, toward the Dragoon Mountains, a false trail. The other one, Nita, the other one is coming straight here." The weight of those words hit her. More fighting, more death, more running, all because of her. Her hand rose instinctively to her face, her fingers tracing the scar as if to make sure the origin of it all was still there. "There, in coming for this," she whispered, exhaustion seeping through her armor. "No," Elias said, his gaze meeting hers over the flames. "They're coming for the warrior who wears them. Your scars aren't the target. They're the proof that the target survived." His words hung in the air between them, heavier than smoke, disarming her in a way no weapon ever had. Nita lowered her hand from her face slowly, her fingers uncurling as if releasing a burden. For years, she had lived with the stares of others. Horror, pity, morbid curiosity, and fearful respect. But in Elias's gaze, there was none of that. There was a raw acceptance, a recognition of the strength forged in pain. He wasn't looking at a monster or a martyr. He was looking at her. And for a moment, the weight of being the marked warrior was replaced by the simple feeling of being seen. The quiet was broken by the crackle of an ember in the fire, a small sound that pulled her back to the urgency of the night. Nita rose, the movement fluid and decisive. The woman who had been shaken by a look gave way to the leader forged in the mountains. "How much time do we have?" she asked, her voice low but resonating with unquestionable authority. Elias met her gaze, the brief moment of intimacy giving way to an iron alliance. "With luck, until the day after tomorrow's dawn. They're moving slow so as not to alert scouts, but they're not stupid. They'll come prepared for a war, not a skirmish." "The day after tomorrow's dawn," Nita repeated. Softly, the phrase echoing the life or death sentence of her people. Her mind was already tracing escape routes, ambush points, necessary sacrifices. She turned to Elias, no longer the woman he had found in a moment of weakness, but the commander he had come to find. "I need you to find the second column, the one heading west. Follow it long enough to be sure it's a feint, and if it's not, to know its real strength. We don't fight ghosts." The plan was already forming, cold and sharp. "We are going to disappear. Before the first sun, this camp will be nothing but stone and wind. Kyle and the elders need to know." Elias didn't hesitate, just a brief nod, understanding passing through his eyes. "Be careful, Nita," he said, his voice a low whisper. "A legend is easier to hunt than a woman." With that, he turned and left as silently as he had entered, a shadow blending into other shadows. Nita stood alone for a moment, the heat of the fire on her face failing to ward off the chill that had settled in her core. His words did not comfort her, but they sharpened her, defining the truth of her existence. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a symbol, and symbols attract fire. She pulled the wool blanket over her shoulders, not for warmth, but as a mantle of authority, and stepped out of her refuge to wake her people for another war. The night did not respond to her determination. The air remained sharp and indifferent. The camp slept the light sleep of the hunted. Nita moved among the wiki-ups, a darker figure against the shadows. There were no shouts, only a firm touch on Kyle's shoulder, a low murmur in the ear of an elder matriarch. The news spread like a shiver down the spine of the camp, a silent wave that woke every warrior, every woman. Within minutes, the rancheria was awake, but the silence was absolute, broken only by the rustling of hides being rolled and the metallic click of a rifle breech being checked. It was the discipline born of desperation, a choreography of survival that everyone knew by heart. There was no panic, only a grim and efficient urgency. The fires were carefully extinguished, their embers buried to leave no trace of heat. The children, awakened from their sleep, did not cry. They clung to their mothers' backs, their large, serious eyes absorbing the silent tension. Each family gathered their few belongings, blankets, some tools, dried meat, and most precious of all, the new weapons and ammunition. Nita did not help with any specific task. Instead, she stood on a high point, her gaze sweeping over the process, her presence an anchor of purpose amidst the frantic, silent movement. She was the map, and her people were the river now changing its course to avoid the approaching rock. Kyle materialized beside her, a specter in the gloom. All are ready. The tracks have been erased. His voice was a whisper the wind carried away. Nita nodded, her gaze passing one last time over the empty space that had been there. Home. There was no time for sentimentality. Homes were a luxury they could no longer afford. With a gesture of her hand, no bigger than the flap of a bat's wing, she gave the order. The column of refugees began to move, a silent serpent gliding into the deeper, unknown bowels of the mountain, each step a prayer against the dawn. Nita took up the rear, her rifle resting with familiarity in her arms. Every sound of the night was a potential enemy, every shadow a threat. The cold penetrated her. Blanket, making her scars throb with a phantom pain, a barometer of her anxiety. Her eyes, accustomed to the darkness, swept over the line of hunched figures before her, lingering for a moment on the small silhouette of the girl from earlier, asleep on her mother's back. It was not for revenge that she fought, nor for glory. It was for that peaceful sleep in the midst of flight, for that unconscious breath that promised a new day. That was the only triumph that mattered. The path they chose was more a whisper of a trail than a passage, winding along cliff faces and dry riverbeds, where a loose stone could echo like a gunshot in the night stillness. Nita felt every hesitant step before her, as if it were her own, every ragged breath of the elders a tightness in her chest. The burden of 100 lives weighed more than her rifle, and the cold seemed to nestle directly in her scars, an icy reminder of the price of every mistake. She was not just their leader, she was the guardian of their fragile existence, and the mountain, her ally and her tormentor, demanded constant vigilance. When the first pale grey of dawn began to tint the eastern sky, Kyle guided her to the mouth of a cave hidden by a curtain of dry ivy, a dark mouth in the mountain that promised temporary refuge. As the Chihenne settled into the cold darkness, exhausted but safe for now, Nita's mind turned to Elias's words. He had not seen her as a broken reflection in the water, but as the blade that had been tempered in the fire. The idea was strange, uncomfortable, and yet a small ember of something that was not shame began to glow in her chest. Being a legend was a burden, but perhaps for the first time, she began to wonder if it couldn't also be a weapon. The air in the cave was icy and smelled of wet stone and contained fear. Nita did not rest. Moving among the families huddled in the recesses, she was a reassuring presence in the gloom. A nod here, a touch on the shoulder there. Her eyes met, those of the same little girl from before, who was now awake, sitting beside her mother. This time, Nita did not look away. The child stood up, and with the solemnity only the very young possess, approached her. Her small, hesitant fingers rose and touched the edge of the main scar on her cheek. There was no revulsion, not even curiosity, just a gentle touch, as if checking if the mountain on her face was real. And then she offered Nita half of her piece of dried meat, a priceless treasure in those times. Nita accepted the gift, the lump in her throat tighter than any knot. That small gesture of pure acceptance did more to heal an old wound than years of victorious battles. Kyle approached her as the girl returned to her mother, his face a mask of concern. "They tell stories about you in the forts, Nita. They say you are a ghost who cannot be killed. That is why they come with such force." Nita looked toward the cave entrance, at the faint gray light of day seeping in. Kyle's words did not sound like a warning, but like a revelation. If it was a ghost they were hunting, she would become one. "Then we will let them hunt," she said, her voice low but vibrating with a new and terrible clarity. "While they chase a ghost, my people will live." She turned to Kale, the decision hardening her features in the dim light. "Gather 5 of your best trackers. Light, fast. The others you will lead. Take the people north, through the howling wind passages. It is treacherous terrain, but it will lead them high into the Sierra, to the hidden valley. There they will be safe." Protest rose in Kale's eyes before it even reached his lips. "And you, we cannot leave you." His voice was a low growl of loyalty and disbelief. "You are not leaving me," Nita corrected, her voice calm and sharp as ice. "You are following orders. The Bluecoats are not looking for a tribe, Kyle. They are looking for a ghost. I and the others will give them a hunt they will not forget. We will drag them east, away from you." There was no more argument. Nita's word was the law forged in the fire of the massacre they all remembered. While Kyle, with a heavy heart, gathered the warriors for the main journey, Nita chose hers. 5 shadows who would move with her, the quietest, the deadliest. There were no formal goodbyes, only the touch of a hand on a mother's arm, a look exchanged with an elder, a nod to Kale that held the full weight of trust and sacrifice. Then the 2 parties separated. The main body of the Chiheni, a silent current of life, plunged deeper into the mountain, led by Kyle. Nita and her 5 warriors stayed behind, watching them go from the mouth of the cave, becoming a small island of defiance, awaiting the approaching tide of steel. The silence that settled in the cave was deep and heavy, a vacuum left by the departure of their people. For a long moment, Nita and the 5 warriors remained like granite statues, listening to the echoes of footsteps that were no longer there. Then she turned to them, their faces carved by the gloom. They were the best. A tracker so old he seemed born of the earth itself. 2 twin brothers who moved as one, a youth whose speed was legendary, and a warrior whose patience was infinite. "We do not fight to kill," Nita said, her voice low and resonant in the cave's stillness. "We fight to be seen. We leave tracks, but only the ones we want them to follow. We are the echo, the branch that snaps on the other side of the canyon, the shadow that vanishes when they look. Our goal is not victory, it is time. Every day we keep them chasing us is another day our people live." When the sunlight finally touched the opposite ridge, tinging the stone a dusty orange, Nita led them out of the cave, not through the entrance, but through a narrow fissure at the back that led them to a higher ledge, an eagle's nest with a view of the valley below. Lying prone on the cold rock, they watched the abandoned camp. It didn't take long. First came the sound, a distant noise of metal and hooves on stone, carried on the thin mountain air. Then they appeared, a column of bluecoats moving with cautious confidence, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. They spread out through the empty rancheria like insects on a corpse, searching for signs of life. Nita watched the officer, a man with binoculars, scanning the slopes. She felt no hatred, only the icy focus of a predator sizing up its prey. The hunt had begun. For a long time, the soldiers scoured the site, their frustration evident in their abrupt movements and loud voices that the breeze carried up to Nita's perch. The officer, now on foot, gestured angrily. Finally, one of the scouts shouted, pointing east in the opposite direction Kyle's people had taken. Nita allowed herself a minimal smile, invisible in the shadow. The tracks the old tracker had left were a work of art, the trail of a large group, moving with haste but not panic, enough to be believable, enough to be the perfect bait. With an almost imperceptible nod, Nita gave the order. It was time to move, to keep their distance, to become the ghost they came to hunt. They did not run. They moved with the fluidity of water over stone, using every crevice and shadow to mask their passage. While the column of soldiers began their noisy pursuit in the valley below, Nita and her warriors climbed, always climbing, staying on higher ground where they could see without being seen. The morning sun warmed the rock, and the heat rose in waves, but to Nita it was just another element to be used. She felt the heat on her face, tracing the lines of her scars, not with pain, but with a sharp clarity. Every step she took away from her people, dragging the danger with her, was a rewriting of that day of massacre. Before, she was the victim. Now, she was the architect of survival, and the mountain was her accomplice. The day dragged on, in a patient game of shadow and distance. Nita and her warriors were the personification of the mountain, silent, watchful, ruthless in their efficiency. They moved only when the column below moved, stopping when they stopped, always maintaining the advantage of the high ground. The midday sun turned the canyon into a furnace, and Nita watched the soldiers slow their pace, their movements heavy with thirst and the weight of their gear. At dusk, the swift young warrior she had chosen descended the slope like a loose stone, leaving behind an accidentally dropped Chiheni canteen, half full of water. It was another crumb on the trail, a bait of hope that would keep them moving in the wrong direction, away from her people. When night fell, bringing a cold that felt sharp as glass, the soldiers finally made camp in a small clearing. Their fires were beacons of vulnerability in the immense darkness. Exhausted, they posted sentries, but their eyes were tired and their minds dulled by the fruitless chase. From above, Nita felt no fatigue, only a cold, crackling energy. The night was her domain. She turned to the twin brothers, their faces nearly invisible in the dark. She needed no words. A gesture with her hand indicated the camp below, and a second gesture drew a circle in the air. They nodded and disappeared, moving in opposite directions to become the unexplainable sound in the darkness, the peripheral movement that would turn the soldiers' sleep into a torment of frayed nerves. The night unfolded in a symphony of fear orchestrated by Nita. There was not a single attack, not one arrow fired. Instead, there was the sound of a twig snapping just beyond the firelight circle, followed by deep silence. An hour later, a rock rolled down a slope on the other side of the camp, the noise unnaturally loud in the stillness. The soldiers, already on edge, jumped at every sound, their anxious whispers turning every shadow into an Apache warrior. They fired at nothing, and the echo of the gunshots only served to deepen the feeling that they were surrounded by ghosts. From her perch, Nita did not watch the men. She listened to the rhythm of their growing fear, feeling their control slipping away like sand through their fingers. Shortly before dawn, when the sky was a deep gray and the soldiers' exhaustion was a palpable fog over the camp, a shadow detached itself from the rock beside Nita. It was Elias, returning as silently as the wind. His face was impassive, but his eyes, as they met hers, held the confirmation she awaited. "It's a feint," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold and the run. "The West Column marched in circles for a day and is now heading back to the fort. All their strength is here, following you." He handed her a piece of hardtack, a practical gesture that carried an unexpected weight. Nita accepted it, her mind already processing the information. The bait had worked. Now she knew exactly how many pieces she was playing with and where they were on the board. Nita broke the hardtack, the dry sound cracking the dawn silence. She ate methodically, chewing slowly as her eyes scanned the camp below, now visible in the growing light. The officer was shouting orders, trying to restore discipline in exhausted and frightened men. Elias's information didn't change the objective, only the scale of the danger and the boldness required to face it. "Good," she whispered, the word a puff of steam in the cold air. "Let them all come. A single herd is easier to lead to the slaughter." She turned to her warriors, who watched her with unshakable patience. "To the Devil's Bridge. The wind funnels there. They won't hear us until it's too late." A nod was their only reply. The group moved as one, dissolving into the reddish rocks that the sun was beginning to kiss. Nita paused beside Elias. "You take the rear. Your eyes see differently than ours. I want to know if they split up, or if any scout tries to flank us." It wasn't a request. It was an order that placed him under her protection, and utilized his strength. He nodded, his intense gaze meeting hers for a brief instant, a silent understanding of the deadly dance they were about to lead. As the soldiers below finally began to follow the cold trail, Nita and her small band of ghosts were already miles away, preparing the next act of a war, fought not with numbers, but with the very soul of the mountain. The march to the Devil's Bridge was a silent dance across the spine of the Sierra. Under the relentless heat, they moved with an economy of motion that the soldiers, with their heavy boots and noisy equipment, could never match. Each of Nita's steps was deliberate, reading the land ahead, noting how the sun turned the rock into a searing plate that would punish the unwary. She felt the heat on her face, the familiar pulling of the scars under the sun, but it was no longer a source of shame. It was a physical reminder of her own resilience, a part of the map of survival she was now imposing on her hunters. Her warriors followed her without question, one body with 6 heads, trusting her ability to turn the mountain's brutality into their greatest weapon. The Devil's Bridge was less a bridge and more a nightmare of stone. A narrow, natural arch suspended over a chasm so deep it swallowed the light. The wind, funneled through the gorge, howled constantly, a lament that masked any sound. It was the perfect place. Without a word, Nita assigned positions. The twin brothers nestled into opposing crevices of the bridge, tasked with rolling pebbles, not boulders, just enough to test the nerves of the men on the narrow passage. The old tracker would prepare a false trail leading past the bridge into the most exposed, waterless terrain. As she watched the preparations, Elias materialized at her side. "They are an hour out, slow." The canteen bait made them more confident. His gaze was not on the bridge, but on her, as the wind whipped her hair across her face. He didn't see the marks on her skin, but the signature the warrior was about to leave on the mountain itself. The signature the warrior is about to leave on the mountain itself is the proof of her legend. Show you stand with Nita by leaving a like on this video and subscribe to witness the trap on the Devil's Bridge snap shut.